sometimes it does have to do with equipment. I remember my quite old aunt giving me a folding camera, a bellows camera. She gave it to me, and it had been a camera I think that she used in the perhaps late 30s, early 40s, when she and her husband, when they were alive, went on grand tours in Europe and elsewhere. And that was my first introduction to cameras. My uncle on the English side of the family also had a camera which I immediately took to aesthetically. It was small. It was what was talked about as a miniature camera, but in fact it was a kind of a crude copy of a Leica film camera. They didn't really have it. Maybe had one or two possible controls, something you could maybe just change a little bit of what you were doing, but basically it was an imitation. It had dials on it that didn't turn, but I coveted this camera, and later on I think I bought one. I think when I was about 17 or 18, something resembling that, which I took some photographs of the very early Jethro Tull. It became part of what I enjoyed doing over the years, was to have a camera with me. And having gone through all of the endless series of film cameras, I finally bit the bullet in 2002 with what then was about the nearest thing to a proper camera. I mean, it only could shoot 2 megapixels of rather dodgy imagery, but I did use it to do some shots for posters and for promo shots. I suppose I became more enamored of digital photography at the point where as I predicted it would, when it equaled or surpassed the quality that you got from film cameras. I can remember probably 10 years ago shooting a whole bunch of comparison shots, and whilst the film, a 400 ASA film was a little bit grainy, but it had a quality, but it certainly didn't have the definition. So once you started taking that 35mm image and blowing it up to fill the screen of a 27-inch iMac, you started to see the shortcomings. Whereas at that point, we were crossing the boundary where digital technology allowed you to get far more definition if you wanted to look on that scale, or conversely, you wanted to crop and blow something up. Digital photography suddenly became a much more useful way for me to follow as a hobby, and occasionally as in a more professional capacity to carry on with photography. I suppose Fuji cameras have been the things that I've stuck with most often, although I've had 3 Leica digital cameras, including, intriguingly, a Leica M10 mono, which simply only shoots black and white. It's an interesting camera to have, as long as you're not leaving it in a dressing room or a hotel room. Because the trouble is, these things are so expensive and valuable, and rather like an expensive flute, I don't like leaving them lying around. And so as a camera to take on tour, it's not something I would do. I tend to take a small Fuji with me with a walk around 40mm equivalent lens. It's pancake lens. It'll fit in my pocket and does a pretty good job, at least to the standard of doing any of the photographs in this book. Many of which were shot, probably most of them were shot with Fuji cameras. But it's technology is technology. At the end, it's not about megapixels, and it's not about necessarily even the superb quality of certain lenses. It's what you're pointing it at and how you capture the emotion. And those are the elements really that make a good photograph. Looking back on the works of other people over the years, I guess it's pretty easy to get to that conclusion where you realize that even a very average camera by today's standards in the hands of someone who really is an artist, will produce images that the rest of us could only dream about. I often think, wouldn't it have been wonderful to have put in the hands of Cartier-Bresson a small digital camera today and to say, hey, carry this around for a day, see what you get. I imagine it would have been very difficult for him to grasp, and the immediacy of it, he wouldn't have seen as an advantage. He probably would have looked upon it as witchcraft. The idea that you could have cameras that would self-focus, would autofocus, whereas of course he had to set up his shots by zone focusing, usually to say, well, the subject I'm going to shoot should be somewhere in there, and it, you know, with this aperture and this film, you know, one way or another, I'll be close enough that it will be moderately in focus. And he would quite often set up shots where he knew that someone would appear in that shot, or that the frame would be filled, and he would capture that moment. Modern technology probably wouldn't have seemed like an asset to somebody whose great work was back in the 50s and 60s. But today, digital photography is a reality, and if you want to have your work available on a variety of physical scales and to be something that allows you flexibility, then, you know, I'm kind of old-fashioned in the sense that if I'm shooting with a Leica, for example, it's manual focusing, and I'm shooting with a lens that requires everything to be done by hand, just as if it was an old film camera. It's the Japanese tea ceremony of photography. You really have to take it slow and simple and be very focused and very prepared. And shooting in that way becomes like the other kind of shooting, that you have to have this real kind of steel yourself for getting that moment, and I find it, you know, in some ways very rewarding to shoot that way. But I get lazy like other people, and especially with fading eyesight, my you know, split image focusing on a rangefinder camera is never going to be quite as good as the autofocusing of today's modern digital cameras. Ultimately, to go back to film photography at this point in my life, certainly I'm not interested in developing and noodling around in a dark room. Ironically, when we bought this house, it had a fully equipped dark room upstairs in the attic, but I've never used it because in all that time, I never really felt compelled to go back and get wet and sticky and make nasty smells around the house with all of the chemicals involved. So I've yet to make a deliberate attempt to go back to film photography, but maybe one day I'll give it a go, just to capture those grainy, rather kind of rough images that I used to take for granted 30, 40 years ago.